Metamorphic contracts have always been a mind bender in the world of Ethereum, where smart contracts are intended to be immutable. Till recently, we haven't seen this feature of Ethereum be used to pull off any sort of high profile attacks. But of course, just recently we saw the governance exploit of Tornado Cash shed a lot of attention on this particular exploit. So much so that this idea of metamorphic contracts is actually being addressed with a new EIP. So how exactly do metamorphic contracts work? How is this used in the exploit of Tornado Cash's governance? And of course, what is this new EIP, and will it actually stop metamorphic contracts from being a thing? Let's answer all of those questions right now in this video. But first, of course, my name is Owen, and over a year and a half ago, I founded Guardian Audits, and since then we've uncovered dozens and dozens and dozens of critical and high vulnerabilities. And my goal with all of these videos that I make, and especially this one, is to distill down all of the knowledge and experience that I've amassed over the past year and a half of doing security audits and 2.5 years plus of just being in the blockchain development space in general, and give it to you so that you can ultimately become a much better blockchain developer, security auditor, whatever your goal is, in fraction of the time, while avoiding many of the mistakes and being able to download the knowledge a lot quicker than I was able to. So with that out of the way, let's dive into metamorphic contracts. Okay, fantastic. So we're going to start off by having a look at how metamorphic contracts was actually used to pull off a very high profile exploit on Tornado Cash's governance. And then we're going to have a look at exactly how these metamorphic contracts can operate, how this actually can happen. And then we're going to take a look at this new EIP and see what it has in store for metamorphic contracts. All right, fantastic. So I have Sam CZ Sun's tweet pulled up here, where he originally disclosed, I think he was the first person to basically show the details of this attack and exactly what the effects are and how it was actually played out. So effectively, like it says here, the attacker was able to grant themselves over 1 million votes and basically take over the entire governance system this way. And so how exactly did this get pulled off, and how was it actually implemented in the governance system? So first of all, the proposal that this attacker created was obviously not thoroughly checked through enough by either the people who voted on it or just a lack of having a third party to validate these proposals. And so the attacker was actually able to add an emergency stop function to this proposal. And so the proposal that was voted on actually included a function that had self-destruct in it. And so either the people voting on the proposal did not care to look for a self-destruct, or they didn't know to. And then obviously there was no third-party validation of this proposal at all, seemingly. So the proposal, ultimately, it had a function that was able to self-destruct the contract. And then this is exactly where the idea of metamorphic contracts come in. So entirely because that self-destruct was in there in that contract, in this emergency stop function. So what the attacker was able to do is actually take the code that was deployed at this current proposal contract and basically self-destruct that and essentially replace it with a brand new proposal contract after this proposal had already been voted on and passed. And you can see the attacker even said that this was the same logic of a past proposal. And so sort of, pulling the wool over the voters' eyes, making it think, this is just another same proposal as, this is another common everyday thing or something like this. And essentially, just telling the voters, like, just give it LGTM on this, and they're able to sneak this function through. So then once that proposal was passed, then of course the attacker was able to end up calling the emergency stop function on that proposal contract and end up self-destructing it, and then ultimately replacing it with a brand new implementation with basically arbitrary code. And then of course with that new implementation, essentially what they're able to do is unlock a bunch of Tornado, governance votes, and then essentially use those votes and ultimately end up taking a ton of torn tokens and giving them to themselves, among other things, other impacts for the protocol. And Sam essentially lays them out here, the complete impact and scope of this sort of governance takeover is that the attacker can withdraw all of the locked votes, they can drain all of the tokens in the governance contract, and of course brick the router. So the real crux of the exploit here lies in this function that has a self-destruct in it. But we need to understand exactly how does just having a self-destruct here and then being able to call it actually open up the system to have one of these metamorphic contracts. So before we exactly understand how metamorphic contracts work, we'll first want to understand how create and create2 opcodes determine the address that is going to end up being deployed to with the new created contract. So first of all, if we have a regular create, and then of course we have create2, these two different opcodes both do the same general idea of just deploying a new contract, but the parameters that each of these takes to determine where that contract will be deployed to is distinctly different. And it's actually a huge key in how metamorphic contracts are able to happen. So first of all, the create opcode here is based on just the message.sender, a hash of the message.sender, as well as the account nonce. So the message.sender and the account nonce of the message.sender, that is what is going to ultimately go into determining the address of the actual resulting contract for the create opcode. And then of course the create2 opcode is also based on the message.sender, but now it has a specific salt for the creation. And then it also depends on the creation code for the contract that's going to be created. And then it's also worth noting that it also includes a byte here of all ones, OX, F, F, and that is mainly to just avoid collisions with things that would be created from the same message.sender with the create opcode. But when we're looking at metamorphic contracts, that's not really important. And then there's another piece of the puzzle here that we need to note first as well, and that is on self-destruct. We will note that the account nonce is reset. So that is a key here to enabling metamorphic contracts in one particular variation, because of course you'll notice that the create is depending on the message.sender and the account nonce. So you might already be able to see at least one way that we can create metamorphic contracts where we are able to deploy a contract initially to one address and then have that contract get self-destructed and then end up being able to deploy a different contract to that same exact address. So now we're going to go over two different ways in which we can actually achieve a metamorphic contract that sort of updates the code that is actually at that address. So first of all, I have a amazing, nice, simple example here pulled up from Pascal. Of course, if you don't already know Pascal and you're not already following him, I would highly recommend that you go give him a follow on Twitter. He puts out the highest tier of alpha, I must say, and of course he has this amazing example for us to study here. Okay, great. So let's just see what is here for us to work with. So first of all, you'll notice we have these contracts A and B, and A has a function to kill, which will self-destruct, and then B does not. And we have a factory, which has basically functions to create an A contract, which can be self-destructed, and a factory to create a B contract, which cannot be self-destructed. This is, a completely different implementation. And then, of course, the factory itself can be self-destructed. So then we have the actual sort of execution of this. So in the setup here, we have a factory being created. So this is the factory that we'll be using to deploy and create the initial instance of the contract that will ultimately become the metamorphic contract. So what we see is we deploy the factory and then we deploy an A contract. And then what we do is we immediately self-destruct A and we also self-destruct the factory. So why do we self-destruct the factory as well? Well, we'll notice that the factory is just using the new keyword operator here, and we don't have any sort of salt to be seen here. So what's happening here is, just like we pointed out, self-destruct is resetting the account nonce. When we self-destruct to the factory, the account nonce is being reset to 0. And then this create is what we're using exactly in the factory, and it's dependent on the message.sender and the nonce. So now let's think about it. If I have a factory, it's deployed at address 1, let's say, and then the factory deploys something from, the message sender of address 1, the nonce is 0. Then let's say that I'm going to end up that, for whatever reason, the hash of that ends up giving you an address of 2. It won't actually, but let's say that it gives you an address of 2. So we're able to deploy the first contract to 2. Then what happens is I delete the contract code that exists at address 2. I also self-destruct the factory here, so the account nonce is reset to 0 as well in the factory. Then what I can do is I can recreate the factory, and pay attention because we need that factory to be able to be recreated at exactly that address, at address 1, so that the message sender can be exactly the same. And then from that address 1, since the account nonce is reset, then what we can do is we can do another create and end up creating exactly a completely different contract to that same address 2, because we can see the create opcode here is not dependent on the contract bytecode or the creation code or anything like this. So what we see here is that after we sort of, kill the metamorphic contract implementation and then we kill the actual factory, then what we can do in a different transaction, of course, is we make a new factory and then we deploy a B. So now what we've done is we make a new factory and ensure that we're using a salt here. So we're actually going to use Create2 here. And so now this factory is going to be deployed to that same address 1. And then now when we create B from that factory, since the account nonce has been reset, then we end up deploying to that account 2 contract B, which is of course a completely different implementation from A, and it could be any arbitrary implementation that you wanted it to be. And so this way, the net effect of doing all of this is that we had a contract at address 2. Somebody saw it. In the case of, perhaps the Tornado Cache governance exploit, people voted on it. They said, that code looks good to me. And then what I did is I said, okay, well, now we're going to take the contract here, toss it out, and here's a new one. It's basically like in that scene in Indiana Jones where he takes the valuable thing and then he puts like a boulder on top of it. That's what they did. And so that is the first way to achieve what is a metamorphic contract. And of course, there is a second way, and of course, potentially other ways as well on top of this that has been well documented by 0AG here. Wrote an entire article on it here, and I highly recommend that you go ahead and read this. We'll put this in the description below. But basically, this approach is, since Create2 here, it relies on the creation code and the salt and the message sender here, but mainly, the interesting part here is the creation code. If I was using Create2 and I wanted to create a metamorphic contract, there's no way that I could change the creation code, which would then change the resulting address of the deployment, which seems contradictory when you think about metamorphic contracts, right? But what you can have is you can have a creation code that actually gets at least a chunk of the bytecode, or basically the implementation of the actual resulting contract. It can get that from calling an external function, right? So if I can have a creation code that's going to interface and get the resulting bytecode from somewhere else, then I can have the same exact creation code that doesn't change at all and have that difference relying on some third-party contract here or something like this. So if I have a creation code that calls function foo to get some bytecode for the resulting contract, then that function foo can, in one case, return the good code, and then in another case, maybe I as an attacker, I can flip a switch in that contract or something like this, have like a Boolean value or what have you. Then on a second call, it can return some malicious code. So this way, as long as I can remove the contract that was initially deployed here, then I can create to deploy with the same creation code, same message sender, same salt, but the only thing that's going to be different is what the creation code is calling into will actually yield a different contract bytecode. And so that is a second way to achieve a metamorphic contract here. And of course, notice that both of those ways really need to have that contract initially have a self-destruct. Indeed, if a contract does not have any way to reach a self-destruct opcode, it doesn't delegate call to any address that could also potentially have a self-destruct opcode, then there is no way for that contract to to change, right? So metamorphic contracts have existed in this capacity for a little while now, and so far they've been relatively harmless in the grand scheme of things without any, huge exploits going on until, of course, this Tornado Cache governance exploit. And I think that has actually sort of spurred on and motivated this new EIP 6780. So if we take a look at this new EIP 6780, we can see that what this EIP does is it only allows self-destruct to actually remove the code at that address if the self-destruct opcode is called within literally the same transaction as the creation of that contract. So anytime self-destruct is called after a contract has been created outside of that very first transaction to create the contract, then the only thing self-destruct will do is actually just take all funds and send all of the funds to the resulting address. But it will not delete the account, right? So it won't clear out the account nonce, it won't clear out the bytecode that's stored at that account. It will only do that full account clearing if it is called within the same transaction as creation. So of course, the question is, does this solve metamorphic contracts? Are metamorphic contracts no longer viable? Well, the answer is somewhat. Now, if I deploy a contract and that's the whole transaction, the transaction is successfully recorded, that's the end of the transaction, then people go observe that contract, they vote on it, it passes governance. Now, even if it has a self-destruct in it, I cannot come along in a later transaction and call the self-destruct opcode or call the function that ultimately calls the self-destruct opcode. And that self-destruct opcode will still take the ether that's in that contract and send it to the requested address, but it will not delete the code at that address. However, if I deploy a contract in a transaction and then go interact with some system, have that system see the code of this contract, think it's passable for whatever reason, and then in that same transaction, call the self-destruct function or a function that calls the self-destruct opcode, and then have that contract actually, it will indeed be a full account clear, right? So we will reset the account nonce and we will remove the contract bytecode. So technically speaking, metamorphic contracts are still achievable only within the same transaction. And then it's also worth noting that you can't immediately redeploy a contract to that address in that same exact transaction because the actual account deletion only happens at the very end of the transaction. And so you need to have that first transaction go through where you first deploy the code, and then in the same transaction, you also self-destruct the account. And then in a separate transaction, now you can go and you can end up deploying back to that same address via, one of the two methods that we just discussed in order to actually end up with a contract that is having different bytecode at that same account address. But in the grand scheme of things, especially considering this Tornado Cache governance exploit, this does curtail a lot of the potential metamorphic contract risks. For instance, this particular exploit would not have been possible if this EIP had been implemented. Of course, this EIP is still in a draft state here, so it is still, of course, subject to change, and it may or may not actually be getting implemented. But regardless, I think that it would be a good addition to curtail the sort of limits and the scope of self-destruct so that we are actually able to avoid a lot of the risk related to metamorphic contracts. And especially so that we don't see more governance exploits across high TVL protocols like this in the future. All right, that's everything on metamorphic contracts and this Tornado Cache governance exploit. I hope you saw very clearly how metamorphic contracts are able to happen. Maybe you can even think of a third way that metamorphic contracts can be achieved, in which case I'm very interested, and I would very much encourage you to put that in the comments down below because I'd like to know. And then also, I want to know, what do you think about this EIP 6780? Do you think this is a good approach to sort of curtail this risk from metamorphic contracts, or do you think the fact that it doesn't completely remove them entirely is something that should be addressed? Either way, let us know in the comment section. And finally, of course, if you are on a protocol team and you're launching a really sick new DeFi application, then I want to hear about it. Are you looking for a smart contract audit? If so, I will do a completely free first pass initial security review of your code base and share all of the glaring vulnerabilities, lacking documentation, suboptimal designs, or anything like this that ought to be fixed before an actual smart contract audit when you apply for a quote at guardianaudits.com/quote. And of course, if you know of a team that is looking for a smart contract security audit, then of course, send them to guardianaudits.com/quote. And of course, if you're looking for a community of several hundred smart contract auditors and Web3 security enthusiasts, and you're looking to really up your security game and connect with others from all across the world and potentially team up and participate in team audits where you get to work with others, craft your own report, and audit a real protocol, and even get rewarded for findings that you uncover, then go ahead and join our community at lab.guardianaudits.com. All right, that is all for this time. I'll see you in the next one.